Did General Motors really believe it could walk away without consequence? Did its leadership honestly think that shutting down an entire manufacturing plant, sending more than 1,200 Canadian workers home without jobs, pocketing billions in public subsidies and then quietly slipping back to Detroit as though nothing had happened, would somehow escape scrutiny? Or did something else unfold, perhaps a shocking October morning when GM realized, far too late, that it had made an irreversible mistake? What followed stunned not only Canada but also Detroit itself, more powerfully than any economic shock the industry had ever faced. On the 21st of October 2025, General Motors confirmed what many workers had feared but dared not believe. The company had decided on a full and permanent teardown of its operations at the CAMI plant in Ingersoll, Ontario. Not a pause, not a delay, an absolute end. The production line for the BrightDrop electric delivery vans was shut down, permanently. Over 1,200 employees were laid off. Not temporarily, not pending review, but removed from their livelihoods for good. The plan had already been inactive since May, leaving a town of just 14,000 people struggling to stay afloat, as the facility had long been the economic backbone of the entire community. And this is precisely where the story becomes extraordinary. Ottawa did not pull its punches with carefully worded statements, nor did it limit itself to diplomatic notes. Instead, Canada responded as a nation that believed it had been betrayed by a long-standing industrial partner. Only 3 days after GM's announcement, the federal government made a move that sent corporate lawyers scrambling across 2 countries. Ottawa slashed nearly 1/4 of GM's duty-free import quota into Canada. The meaning was unmistakable. Every GM vehicle built in the United States and destined for Canadian showrooms would now face a punitive 25% tariff. Overnicht. Stellantis was hit even harder. After shifting Jeep production to Illinois, its duty-free access was cut by half. This was not retaliation in anger, it was retaliation in strategy. A message delivered with the precision of a nation unwilling to be taken for granted. Canada was effectively saying, you accepted our taxpayers' money, you made commitments, you gave assurances, and now you will be held to your word or you will face the consequences. And if you're watching this broadcast and believe that governments have a duty to protect their workers when corporations break their promises, then tap like and subscribe to Starscope News, because what happened next is a demonstration of what real defense of workers can look like. To understand the magnitude of the moment, we must go back. In 2022, GM committed to modernize the Ingersoll facility as a long-term electric vehicle hub. Ottawa and the province of Ontario invested billions to bring the project to life. BrightDrop was marketed as a breakthrough, a cornerstone of North America's clean energy strategy, a promise of decades of secure employment. GM accepted every dollar. But by April 2025, production abruptly halted, with the company citing weak demand. Workers were told operations would resume in May. Some believed it. Some hoped. But the line never started again. By May, over 1,200 workers were out, their futures uncertain, their community beginning to fracture under the weight of uncertainty. Summer rolled by in silence. Juillet. August. September. No communication from Detroit. Just anxiety. Family watch bills rise and incomes fall. Benefits were questioned. Days turned into weeks, then months, and for the thousands relying on the plant, hope became a fraying thread. This was no ordinary factory, this was Canada's first large-scale EV plant, meant to anchor the nation's future in clean energy manufacturing. And GM simply walked away. But Ottawa had not been caught off guard. Behind the scenes, ministers and advisors analyzed every scenario, prepared every legal avenue and monitored every development. When GM finally declared the closure permanent on the 21st of October, the Canadian government was ready. And this is where the geopolitical and economic landscape shifts dramatically. Early in the year, Canada introduced something known as the Auto Diminution Framework. The name may sound bureaucratic, but the power it carries is immense. Under this mechanism, vehicles imported from the United States face a 25% tariff unless the manufacturer maintains active production within Canada and honors its commitments to jobs and investment. In other words, keep your promises and Canada will exempt you. Break your promises and you lose your privileges. GM blocked them. And so, on the 23rd of October, the hammer fell. Finance Minister François-Philippe Champagne and Industry Minister Melanie Joly issued a joint statement accusing both GM and Stellantis of acting contrary to their commitments to Canada and its workers. Ottawa then cut GM's duty-free quota by precisely 24.2%. Suddenly, every GM vehicle built in the United States and shipped to Canada cost dramatically more the moment it crossed the border. Profit margins collapsed. Dealers in Michigan and Ohio began to panic as the price of their own vehicles soared for Canadian buyers, while European competitors faced no such penalties. Chrysler, after shifting operations to Illinois, was struck even harder with a sharper cut to its tariff privileges. What commanded the biggest headlines was Joly's next move. She issued an official, curt and uncompromising letter to Stellantis, reminding the company of its legal obligations to maintain a Canadian presence and warning that failure to do so would result in a clawback of federal funding. GM received a similar notice. The message from Ottawa could not have been clearer: you have 15 days to produce a concrete, detailed plan for a new vehicle at the Ingersoll plant. Note ideas. Note vague commitments. A full plan, with dates, numbers and proof. And Canada had already demonstrated it would enforce every word. The immediate financial shock was dramatic. GM suddenly realized it had no alternative production strategy for the electric vans initially destined for Ingersoll. ETS American dealers, already struggling with inventory shortages, were now facing a 25% tariff at the border. Vehicles that cost $45,000 to produce were arriving in Canada priced over $56,000 once tariffs were added. Customers walked away. Inventory stalled. Showrooms in the American Midwest were thrown into confusion as their Canadian market evaporated overnight. All of this because GM broke its commitments. This wasn't a theoretical risk, it was unfolding hour by hour, dealership by dealership. And the stock market noticed, because this time the consequences weren't symbolic, they were financial, structural and ongoing. Meanwhile, real lives were at the heart of this crisis. Picture a single mother in Ingersoll who has worked 12 years in the plant. 12 years of seniority. 12 years of stability. Then in May she is temporarily laid off. She waits. She hopes. She cuts expenses. She prays the company is telling the truth. Then October arrives. Permanent closure. No new model. No return. Suddenly everything is at risk: her pension, her mortgage, her children's future. Inflation has pushed up the price of everything from groceries to school supplies. And what she receives from GM is silence. This is why Ottawa decided enough was enough. GM had accepted billions of Canadian dollars. GM had made commitments to Canadian workers. GM then abandoned those commitments. Which is why Canada used its economic sovereignty to respond. Action, not rhetoric. What shocked the industry most, however, was what happened next. Within just 3 weeks of the new tariffs, Detroit's corporate landscape began shifting. Ford announced it was reassessing its long-term Canadian investment strategy. Stellantis abruptly reshuffled senior leadership, removing its Canadian CEO. GM quietly contacted Ontario officials to explore options for returning to Ingersoll, an indirect admission that its original strategy had failed. Supply chain analysts immediately recalculated the numbers. If GM maintained production in Canada, it could avoid punitive tariffs entirely. If it stayed in the United States and merely exported to Canada, its costs would rise by up to 20%. And so, the economics shifted. The idea of reopening the Ingersoll plant, once considered impractical and now seemed cheaper than absorbing permanent penalties at the border. The pressure was working. Unifor, the union representing auto workers, began receiving unexpected calls not only from workers seeking clarity, but from corporate executives at Stellantis and GM asking what they needed to do to fix the situation. This wasn't a coincidence. It was leverage. It was a government using its tools to defend workers, not corporations. For years Canadian workers were told they had little negotiating power because companies could simply shift production elsewhere, usually Mexico or the United States. But under the economic strategy shaped by Mark Carney and enforced by ministers like Melanie Joly, Canada has shifted from pleading to planning, from hoping for corporate goodwill to building strategic resilience. Housing investment, defense expansion, procurement reform, and major projects coordination, all of this has strengthened Canada's ability to act independently, not as an extension of American corporate interests. What shocked the industry most, however, was what happened next. Within just 3 weeks of the new tariffs, Detroit's corporate landscape began shifting. Ford announced it was reassessing its long-term Canadian investment strategy. Stellantis abruptly reshuffled senior leadership, removing its Canadian CEO. GM quietly contacted Ontario officials to explore options for returning to Ingersoll, an indirect admission that its original strategy had failed. Supply chain analysts immediately recalculated the numbers. If GM maintained production in Canada, it could avoid punitive tariffs entirely. If it stayed in the United States and merely exported to Canada, its costs would rise by up to 20%. And so, the economics shifted. The idea of reopening the Ingersoll plant, once considered impractical and now seemed cheaper than absorbing permanent penalties at the border. The pressure was working. Unifor, the union representing auto workers, began receiving unexpected calls not only from workers seeking clarity, but from corporate executives at Stellantis and GM asking what they needed to do to fix the situation. This wasn't a coincidence. It was leverage. It was a government using its tools to defend workers, not corporations. For years Canadian workers were told they had little negotiating power because companies could simply shift production elsewhere, usually Mexico or the United States. But under the economic strategy shaped by Mark Carney and enforced by ministers like Melanie Joly, Canada has shifted from pleading to planning, from hoping for corporate goodwill to building strategic resilience. Housing investment, defense expansion, procurement reform, and major projects coordination, all of this has strengthened Canada's ability to act independently, not as an extension of American corporate interests. And businesses are noticing. When Canada cut GM's quota, threatened legal action, and delivered the 15-day ultimatum, corporations across aerospace, pharmaceuticals, energy and tech all took note. Funding would no longer come with no strings attached. Subsidy would no longer be unconditional. Accountability would be real. The central question now is whether GM will comply. If the company presents a serious plan for production at the Ingersoll plant, the tariff reductions could be restored. If not, the penalties will continue indefinitely. The calculus is simple. Honor your commitments and Canada stands behind you. Break them and the government has tools and is willing to use them. By early November, the strategy was already bearing fruit. GM requested meetings. Stellantis shifted personnel. The balance of power began to tilt. Corporations that once took Canada for granted suddenly had to negotiate on Canada's terms. And for the first time in decades, Canadian workers saw a government prepared not only to listen to them but to fight for them. This moment signals something much larger than a single plant closure. It reflects a profound shift in Canada's economic identity. No longer Detroit's backyard. No longer a passive participant in North America's auto sector. But an independent nation that defends its workers, protects its subsidies and enforces its agreements. And if you understand the significance of what has just happened and recognize that this is only the beginning of a much larger strategic transformation, then stay with US because the next steps in Canada's economic strategy may reshape not just one industry, but the future of Canadian sovereignty itself.